The fellowship hall of the small white church glowed with warmth that evening, its soft yellow lights reflecting off polished wooden floors. Long tables stretched from one end of the room to the other, dressed in simple checkered cloths and lined with casseroles, pies, and bowls of steaming vegetables. The comforting smell of baked bread and roasted chicken filled the air, wrapping itself around the laughter and chatter of a close-knit community. Everyone seemed to know everyone. Everyone, except Emily Harper. She sat halfway down one of the tables, her hands folded neatly in her lap, a paper plate resting untouched in front of her. A glass of sweet tea sweated quietly beside it. She had arrived early, too early, perhaps, thinking it might make things easier. It hadn't. Instead, it only gave her more time to notice the way people naturally gathered into familiar circles, greeting each other with hugs, warm smiles, and inside jokes that came from years of shared history. The hum of conversation inside the fellowship hall carried on, steady and familiar, like a rhythm the town had known for years. Laughter rose and fell in waves, plates clinked softly, and the scent of warm food lingered in every corner. For most people in the room, the evening felt ordinary, another gathering, another chance to reconnect. But just beyond the double doors, something, or rather, someone, was about to change that rhythm. The door creaked open with a soft, almost unnoticed sound. A few heads turned out of habit, but not many. In a town like this, people came and went freely, and late arrivals weren't unusual. Still, there was something about the man who stepped inside that carried a quiet presence. Luke Dawson paused just inside the doorway, removing his hat out of respect before stepping fully into the room. The brim had shielded his face from the fading sun outside, and now, under the warm indoor lights, his features came into view. Calm, steady, and marked by the kind of quiet confidence that didn't need attention to be noticed. Dust clung lightly to his boots, a sign that he had come straight from work. His sleeves were rolled just enough to reveal strong, weathered forearms, and though his appearance spoke of long hours and open land, there was nothing rough about the way he carried himself. If anything, there was a gentleness to him, a grounded ease that made him seem both present and unhurried. A few people greeted him as he stepped further inside. "Evening, Luke," someone called from across the room. "Glad you made it," said another. He answered each greeting with a nod or a small smile, never lingering too long. Luke wasn't the kind of man who sought the center of attention. He belonged here, that much was clear, but he didn't need to prove it. Instead, his gaze moved, slowly across the room. Not scanning in a restless way, but searching, like someone looking for something specific without fully knowing what it was. He noticed the familiar clusters first. Families gathered close, old friends leaning into easy conversations, couples sharing quiet smiles over their meals. It was a picture of belonging, one that most people in the room took for granted, and then his eyes paused. Halfway down one of the long tables sat a woman he didn't recognize. Emily Harper. She wasn't doing anything unusual. Just sitting there, shoulders slightly drawn in, her attention fixed somewhere between her plate and the passing movement around her. To anyone else, she might have blended into the background completely. But Luke noticed the empty chair beside her. And more than that, he noticed the way she seemed to carry that emptiness without saying a word. There was nothing dramatic about it, no obvious sign asking for attention, but sometimes the quietest things were the easiest to feel. Luke didn't look away right away. He watched just long enough to understand something simple. She wasn't just alone. She was trying not to be. Across the room, someone waved him over, gesturing toward an open seat at a crowded table. It would have been the easy choice. Familiar. Faces, effortless conversation. A place where he already belonged. Luke gave a small nod in acknowledgement, but he didn't move in that direction. Instead, he adjusted his grip on his hat and took a step forward, then another, his path leading him not toward comfort, but toward something quieter, toward the woman sitting beside the empty chair. Each step was unhurried, natural, as though the decision didn't require thought. And maybe it didn't. For Luke, some things were simple. You noticed when someone was left out. You did something about it. Emily, meanwhile, remained unaware. She had just taken another small sip of her tea, her thoughts drifting somewhere far from the room when she sensed movement nearby. At first, she assumed it was someone passing behind her chair, another blur in the busy evening. But then the movement stopped, right beside her table. She looked up. For a brief second, her mind struggled to place what she was seeing. Not because it was confusing, but because it was unexpected. A man stood there, hat in hand, his expression open and calm, as though he had every reason in the world to be exactly where he was. Their eyes met. And in that quiet, unspoken moment, something shifted, so subtle it might have gone unnoticed by anyone else. But for Emily, it felt like the room had softened around the edges. Luke offered a small, respectful smile, the kind that didn't demand anything in return. Not attention, not conversation, just acknowledgement. And standing there beside the empty chair, he seemed to see her in a way no one else in the room had yet. The noise of the hall continued on, unchanged, unaware. But at that table, in that single moment, something new had begun. Emily wasn't part of any of that. She had moved to town just 3 weeks ago, taking a teaching position at the local elementary school. It had seemed like a fresh start at the time. A quieter place, a slower pace. Somewhere she could rebuild without the weight of everything she'd left behind. Back then, the idea of a small town had felt comforting. But sitting here now, she realized something no one had told her. Small towns could feel very big when you didn't belong. A burst of laughter rose from the table behind her, and Emily glanced over her shoulder. A group of women leaned close together, sharing stories as they passed around a homemade pie. One of them reached out to squeeze another's hand, their connection effortless and real. Emily quickly looked away, not wanting to stare. Her eyes drifted instead to the empty chair beside her. It had been empty since she sat down. At first, she had told herself someone would take it, maybe a late arrival, maybe someone looking for space. But as the minutes passed and the room filled, it became clear that the seat wasn't just unoccupied. It was unnoticed, just like her. Emily forced a small smile as someone walked past, though the person didn't see it. She picked up her fork, moving a piece of food around her plate without taking a bite. Her appetite had disappeared somewhere between walking through the door and realizing she didn't know a single person well enough to start a conversation. She wasn't shy, not really. Back at her old school, she had been known as friendly, approachable, the kind of teacher students trusted and colleagues relied on. But that had been a different life, a different version of her. Here, she felt. Quieter, careful, as if speaking too loudly or stepping too boldly might remind everyone that she was new, that she didn't yet fit. Across the room, a man stood to say a short blessing before the meal truly began. Heads bowed, voices softened, and for a brief moment the entire hall settled into a peaceful stillness. Emily closed her eyes too, letting the calm wash over her. She whispered a silent hope. Not for anything big, just something simple, something to make this place feel less unfamiliar. When the prayer ended, the room returned to life. Plates were filled, chairs scraped against the floor, and conversations picked up right where they had left off. The warmth came rushing back, but it seemed to move around Emily rather than reach her. She took a small sip of her tea and glanced once more at the empty chair beside her. It felt heavier now, not just a seat, but a quiet reminder of everything she hadn't found yet in this town. Friendship, connection, a sense of belonging. She wondered briefly if she should have stayed home tonight. It would have been easier, safer. But something in her had wanted to try. even if trying meant sitting, alone. Emily straightened slightly in her chair, drawing in a slow, steady breath. She wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. Maybe this was just how beginnings felt. Awkward, uncertain, a little lonely. Her fingers lightly touched the edge of the empty chair, almost as if confirming it was real. Then she let her hand fall back, to her lap. Around her, the evening carried on, full of life, full of connection, full of everything she was still searching for. And for a moment, as she sat quietly in the middle of it all, Emily Harper wondered if anyone would notice she was there at all, or if she would simply remain the woman with the empty chair beside her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The sounds of the fellowship hall carried on around them, laughter, conversation, the soft clatter of dishes. But at the small stretch of table where Emily sat, everything seemed to quiet just a little. Not completely silent, but softened, as though the world had taken a step back to make room for something simple and unexpected. Emily looked up at the man standing beside her. Up close, he seemed even more at ease than he had from a distance. There was no rush in him, no awkward hesitation, just a steady calm that made his presence feel natural, like he belonged wherever he chose to stand, and right now, he had chosen to stand beside her. She wasn't sure what to say. It had been a long time since someone had approached her so directly, without introduction, without obligation. For a split second, her instinct was to glance behind her, to make sure he was actually speaking to her. But there was no one else there, just the empty chair, and him. Luke shifted his hat lightly in his hands, his voice warm but easy when he finally spoke. "Mind if I sit here?" he asked, nodding toward the chair beside her. Emily blinked, caught off guard. Not by the question itself, but by how gently it was asked, as if her answer truly mattered. "Oh, no, yes." "You can sit," she said, her words tumbling slightly as she tried to recover her composure. A faint hint of embarrassment touched her cheeks, but she managed a small smile. Luke's expression softened just a little more, as though he understood the moment without needing it explained. "Well," he added, a quiet hint of humor in his tone, "I was hoping you might save me a seat." The words were simple, almost casual, but something about them landed differently. Save me a seat. Not, can I take this one? Not, is anyone sitting here? It felt intentional. Emily glanced briefly at the empty chair, then back at him. For reasons she couldn't quite explain, the space beside her no longer felt like a symbol of absence. It felt like something waiting to be filled. "I think I can do that," she replied softly. Luke gave a small nod, as though that settled everything. Then, without any rush, he pulled out the chair and sat down beside her. The movement was easy, unforced, like it had always been meant to happen. For a second, Emily wasn't sure what to do next. She adjusted her hands in her lap, then reached for her glass of tea, taking a small sip just to have something to do. She could feel the shift inside herself. Not dramatic, not overwhelming, just a quiet awareness that she was no longer alone at the table. And somehow, that changed everything. Luke rested his hat gently on the table beside him, keeping his posture relaxed. He didn't immediately fill the silence with words, which, strangely enough, made it easier for Emily to breathe. There was no pressure to perform, no expectation to carry the conversation. Just space, comfortable space. After a moment, he glanced at her plate, then back up at her with a faint smile. "Food's pretty good here," he said, "though I think the pies are what everyone really shows up for." Emily let out a small, almost surprised laugh. It wasn't loud, but it was real. "I haven't tried anything yet," she admitted, glancing down at her plate. "I think I got a little distracted." Luke nodded, as though that made perfect sense. "Happens," he said simply. No judgment, no teasing, just understanding. That, more than anything, eased the last bit of tension in her shoulders. Emily picked up her fork again, this time actually taking a bite. The food was warm, comforting, just like the room around her. Only now, she could feel that warmth reaching her too. "So, you're new here, aren't you?" Luke asked after a moment, his tone casual but attentive. Emily looked up, a little surprised. "Is it that obvious?" He gave a slight shrug, a hint of a smile returning. "Small town," he said. "You notice when someone new shows up. There was no edge to it, no sense of being examined or judged. Just a simple observation." Emily nodded slowly. "I moved here a few weeks ago," she said. "I'm teaching at the elementary school." "That's so," Luke replied, leaning back slightly in his chair. "Then I guess this town's already better off." The words were said lightly, but they carried a sincerity that caught her off guard again. Emily felt her cheeks warm, but this time she didn't look away. "Thank you," she said quietly. Around them, the fellowship hall continued as it always had. Full of life, full of voices, full of connection. But at their table, something new had taken root. The empty chair was no longer empty. And for the first time that evening, Emily Harper didn't feel like she was just passing through unnoticed. She felt seen, not in a grand or overwhelming way, but in the kind of quiet, steady way that mattered most. The conversation didn't suddenly become effortless. Even after Luke sat down and the empty chair was no longer empty, there was still a quiet awkwardness. Between them, soft, uncertain, but not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that comes when two people are careful with each other, unsure yet willing. Emily became aware of small things she hadn't noticed before. How she held her fork, the way she sat, even the sound of her own voice when she spoke. It had been a long time since a simple conversation felt like something she had to relearn, but Luke didn't rush her through it. He sat beside her with the same steady ease, as if time moved a little slower for him. He picked up his own plate, taking a bite now and then, giving the moment space instead of filling it too quickly. It wasn't indifference, it was patience, and that made all the difference. "So," Luke said after a few seconds, glancing at her with a mild, friendly expression, "how's the school treating you so far?" It was a simple question. Safe. Easy, but it opened a door. Emily nodded slightly, grateful for something she could answer without overthinking. "It's good," she said, then paused, searching for the right words. "The kids are great, energetic but sweet." Luke smiled faintly. "That sounds about right," he replied. "Town's full of energy in small packages." Emily let out a small laugh at that. "Quieter than before, but more natural. I'm still learning names," she added, "and figuring out who's who. It feels like everyone already knows each other." "They do," Luke said, not unkindly. "Most folks here grew up together, same schools, same streets, same stories." There was no pride in the statement, no exclusion, just a matter-of-fact truth. Emily looked down at her plate for a moment. "Yeah," she said softly. "I guess I'm still catching up." Luke didn't immediately respond. Instead, he leaned his elbows lightly on the table, his gaze thoughtful but not intense. When he spoke again, his voice was calm. "Takes time," he said. "But people here, they come around." Emily glanced at him, unsure if he was just being polite or if he actually meant it. "And if they don't?" she asked, half joking, though there was a trace of honesty beneath it. Luke's smile returned, a little more certain this time. "Then you find the ones who do." The answer was simple, not dramatic, not overly reassuring, but something about it settled in her chest. For a moment, neither of them spoke again. Emily took another bite of her food, this time without hesitation. Around them, the room carried on. Someone called out across the hall. A group nearby burst into laughter. Chairs shifted as people got up for seconds. Life moving forward. At a table just a few seats away, an older woman glanced over at them briefly, her expression curious but warm. She nudged the person beside her, whispering something with a small smile. Emily noticed but quickly looked back down, unsure how to interpret it. Luke, however, didn't seem bothered at all. "Don't mind them," he said quietly, as if reading her thoughts. "Town likes to notice things." Emily raised an eyebrow slightly. "Things?" she repeated. "New faces," he clarified. "New conversations." There was a subtle hint of humor in his voice, enough to ease the self-conscious feeling that had started to creep in. Emily relaxed a little more in her chair. "Well," she said, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "I hope I'm not too interesting." Luke chuckled softly. "I think you're doing just fine." It wasn't a bold compliment, but it didn't feel empty either. For Emily, that mattered. The conversation drifted again, not into silence this time, but into something quieter, more comfortable. They spoke about small things, how unpredictable the weather had been lately, how the town's main street seemed to close earlier than she expected, how the church gatherings always seemed to involve more food than anyone could finish. Nothing deep, nothing heavy. But each word felt like a small step forward. Emily began to notice something she hadn't expected. She wasn't thinking as much about what to say next. The pressure she had carried into the room earlier was slowly loosening its grip. She didn't have to impress him. She didn't have to explain everything about herself. She could just be. Luke, for his part, never pushed beyond what she offered. When she spoke, he listened. When she paused, he didn't rush to fill the gap. It created a rhythm, uneven at first, but steady enough to build on. At one point, Emily caught herself smiling without realizing it. Not out of politeness, but because something about the moment felt easy. It surprised her. Just an hour ago, the idea of sitting through the supper had felt exhausting. Now, she found herself not wanting to leave just yet, and as she glanced briefly at the chair beside her, the one that had felt so heavy before, it no longer carried that same weight. It was just a chair now, occupied, included, part of something. Emily looked back at Luke, who was casually finishing another bite of food, completely at ease. "Thanks for sitting here," she said, her voice quiet but sincere. Luke glanced at her, his expression steady. By the time the plates were half empty and the hum of the room had softened into an easy rhythm, something between Emily and Luke had shifted. The awkwardness hadn't disappeared completely, but it had settled, like dust after a long day, leaving behind something clearer. Conversation came a little easier now. Not fast, not effortless, but real. Emily rested her hands around her glass of tea, her fingers tracing the cool surface as she listened to Luke describe his mornings on the ranch. There was a quiet steadiness in the way he spoke. No exaggeration, no attempt to impress, just simple, honest details. "Sun's usually up before I am," he said, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "But I try to beat it anyway." Emily smiled softly. "That sounds early." "It is," he admitted. "But you get used to it. There's something about those first few hours. Everything's quiet. Feels like the day hasn't decided what it's going to be yet." Emily tilted her head slightly, considering that. "I think I'd like that part," she said. "The quiet." Luke nodded, as though he understood exactly what she meant. "It's the best part," he replied. For a moment, neither of them spoke, but this time, the silence felt different, less like something to fill and more like something to share. Emily glanced down at her plate, then back up again, as if weighing whether to say something more. "I moved here for the quiet," she admitted. After a pause, Luke's attention shifted fully to her. Not intense, not intrusive, just present. "Yeah," he said. She nodded. "I used to teach in a bigger town. Everything was busy, loud, always something happening." She hesitated, searching for the right words. "I thought a smaller place might feel simpler." "And does it?" Luke asked, gently. Emily let out a small breath, somewhere between a laugh and a sigh. "I'm still figuring that out," she said honestly. It wasn't the whole story, but it was enough. Luke didn't press further. He didn't ask why she left or what she had been looking for. Instead, he gave a small nod, as if accepting what she had offered without needing more. "Simple's not always easy," he said after a moment. "But it's usually worth it." Emily looked at him, surprised by the quiet certainty in his voice. "You sound like you've had a lot of practice with it," she said. A hint of amusement crossed his face. "Ranch life doesn't leave much." "Room for complicated," he replied. "Animals don't care about your plans. Weather doesn't either. You just take things as they come." Emily smiled at that. "I could probably learn from that. Most of us could," Luke said lightly. Their conversation drifted again, but this time it carried a little more depth beneath the surface. Luke shared small stories, nothing grand, just moments. A stubborn calf that refused to follow the herd. A fence that took longer to fix than it should have. Evenings spent watching the sky change colors over open land. As he spoke, Emily found herself picturing it all. The wide spaces, the quiet mornings, the steady rhythm of a life rooted in routine and patience. It felt very different from where she had come from, and yet something about it felt grounding. "What made you stay?" she asked suddenly. Luke paused, considering the question. Then he shrugged slightly. "Never really thought about leaving," he said. "This place, it's home." The word lingered for a moment between them. Home. Emily lowered her gaze, her fingers tightening slightly around her glass. "I think that's what I'm trying to find," she said quietly. The admission surprised even her. She hadn't planned to say it out loud, but now that she had, it felt honest, in a way that was hard to take back. Luke didn't respond right away. He looked at her, not with curiosity, not with judgment, but with a kind of understanding that didn't need explanation. "Well," he said after a moment, his tone calm, "you picked a good place to start." Emily looked up again, meeting his eyes. There was no promise in his words, no guarantee, just a simple belief. And for some reason, that felt enough. Around them, the supper carried on. People refilling plates, laughter echoing from the far end of the hall, someone calling out, "For more coffee." The evening was moving forward, just like it always did. But at their table, time felt a little slower, a little steadier. Emily realized she wasn't thinking about leaving anymore. She wasn't watching the door or counting the minutes. Instead, she was listening, sharing, being part of something, even if it was just a quiet conversation between two people who had been strangers an hour ago. And as she sat there, across from a man who spoke in simple truths and easy silences, she felt something unfamiliar begin to settle in her chest. Not certainty, not belonging, not yet, but the beginning of it. Something small, something real. And for the first time since she arrived in town, Emily Harper felt like she might not be as far from home as she once thought. By the time the last plates were cleared and the hum of conversation inside the fellowship hall began to thin, the evening had softened into something quieter. People drifted toward the doors in small groups, carrying leftover dishes, folding chairs, or simply lingering to stretch out the night a little longer. Outside, the air was cool and gentle. A string of warm lights had been hung across the churchyard, casting a soft golden glow over the grass. It wasn't elaborate, just a few strands stretched between wooden posts, but it transformed the space into something calm and inviting. Fireflies flickered faintly at the edges, and the distant sound of crickets filled the silence between conversations. Emily stepped out onto the grass, drawing in a slow breath. The air felt different from inside, lighter, fresher. For a moment, she simply stood there, letting it settle around her. The evening had gone differently than she expected. Better, in a way she hadn't quite prepared herself for. She folded her arms loosely, not out of discomfort, but out of habit, her gaze drifting upward toward the lights. They do this every few weeks. Luke's voice came from just behind her. Emily turned slightly, finding him standing a few steps away, his hat back on now, his posture as relaxed as ever. "The lights?" she asked. He nodded. "Yeah, gives folks a reason to stay a little longer." Emily smiled faintly, glancing back at the glowing strands overhead. "I like it," she said. "It's simple." Luke stepped closer, his boots quiet against the grass. "Seems to be a theme around here," he replied. Emily let out a soft laugh. "I'm starting to notice that." For a moment they stood side by side, not speaking. Around them, small groups chatted quietly, their voices blending into the night without breaking its calm. Somewhere off to the side, someone laughed gently, the sound carrying just far enough to feel present without being loud. Luke shifted his weight slightly, then glanced at her. "You want to walk a bit?" he asked. The question was easy, unforced. Emily hesitated, not because she didn't want to, but because she wasn't used to being asked something so simply. There was no expectation in his voice, no pressure, just an open offer. She nodded. "Yeah, I'd like that." They started walking slowly along the edge of the yard, their pace unhurried. The grass softened their steps, and the quiet stretched comfortably between them. Emily found herself watching the ground for a moment, then lifting her gaze again, taking in the small details she might have missed before, the way the light caught on the leaves of a nearby tree, the gentle sway of the hanging bulbs, the peaceful rhythm of the night. "It's different out here," she said after a moment. Luke glanced at her. "Different how?" Emily thought for a second. "Back where I lived before, nights didn't really feel like this," she said. "There was always noise, cars, people, something." She paused, then added, "This feels calmer." Luke nodded, looking out. "Across the yard. Not much out here to make noise," he said. "Just wind and whatever the land decides to do." Emily smiled softly. "I think I prefer it." They walked a few more steps before the conversation shifted again, this time more naturally than before. Emily found herself asking small questions about the ranch, about how long Luke had lived here, about the town itself. And each answer he gave felt grounded, simple, and steady. In return, she shared a little more too. Not everything, but more than she had planned. "I used to stay late at work a lot," she admitted at one point. "Even when I didn't have to." Luke looked at her, curious but not pressing. "Why's that?" Emily shrugged lightly. "I guess it was easier than going home," she said, her voice quieter now. The honesty of it surprised her. She hadn't meant to say something so direct, but under the soft glow of the lights, it didn't feel as heavy as it might have before. Luke didn't respond right away. He let the words sit, giving them space instead of trying to fix them. "Home should feel better than that," he said finally. Emily looked down for a moment, then nodded. "Yeah," she said. "I think that's what I'm hoping for this time." They reached the far edge of the yard, where the lights faded slightly and the night stretched out darker and deeper. For a second, they both slowed, almost stopping, as if neither of them was in a hurry to turn back. Emily wrapped her arms lightly around herself again, though this time it wasn't from unease. It was just the cool air settling in. "I'm glad I came tonight," she said quietly. Luke glanced at her, his expression calm but warm. "Me too." The words were simple, but they didn't feel casual. They stood there for a moment longer, the quiet wrapping around them in a way that felt natural instead of empty. No rush, no need to fill the silence, just two people sharing the same space under soft lights and an open sky. Eventually, they turned back toward the church, walking side by side again. In the days that followed the church supper, Emily found herself noticing small changes, subtle at first, almost easy to miss. The town hadn't transformed overnight, and neither had she. But something had shifted, quietly and steadily, like the beginning of a new season. Monday morning came with its usual routine. The school hallways buzzed with energy as children hurried to their classrooms, their voices bright and unfiltered. Emily stood by her door, greeting each student as they walked in, offering smiles and soft words of encouragement. But this time, something felt different. She wasn't just going through the motions. She felt present. "Good morning, Miss Harper," one of her students called out enthusiastically. "Good morning," she replied, her smile a little easier than before. Throughout the day, she caught herself laughing more, genuinely, without hesitation. When a student struggled, she knelt beside them patiently. When another shared a story that wandered far from the lesson, she listened instead of rushing them along. It wasn't that she hadn't cared before, but now there was a lightness to her, a sense that she wasn't carrying everything on her own anymore. And though she didn't say it out loud, she knew part of that change had started with a simple moment at a long table and a cowboy who chose to sit beside her. Later that afternoon, as the final bell rang and the school emptied out, Emily gathered her things slowly. She didn't feel the same urgency to leave as she had before. Instead, she lingered, organizing her desk, straightening a few papers, letting the quiet settle around her. A soft knock came at the door. She looked up. Luke stood in the doorway. Not in a way that demanded attention. Just there, leaning lightly against the frame, his hat tipped back slightly. Emily blinked, surprised, but not unsettled. "Hi," she said, a small smile forming. "Hey," he replied. "Hope I'm not interrupting." She shook her head. "No, I was just finishing up." Luke nodded, stepping inside just enough to close the distance without crowding her space. "I was in town," he said casually. "Thought I'd see how your first week's really going." Emily paused for a second, taking in the simplicity of that. No big reason, no complicated explanation. He had just thought to check in. "It's going well," she said. "Better than I expected, actually." "Glad." To hear it," Luke replied, his tone steady. There was a brief silence, but not the awkward kind. The kind that comes when there's no pressure to fill it. Then Emily picked up her bag, glancing toward the door. "I was about to head out," she said. "If you're not in a rush." Luke gave a slight shake of his head. "Not particularly." They walked out of the school together, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the pavement. The town moved at its usual pace, unhurried, familiar. A few people passed by, offering small waves or nods of recognition. This time, Emily noticed something new. Some of those gestures were meant for her, too. It was subtle, a brief smile from a woman she had seen at the church supper, a polite nod from someone walking past. But it was there. She wasn't invisible anymore. As they reached the sidewalk, Luke glanced at her. "There's a small market down the road," he said. "Fresh. Produce, baked goods, nothing fancy." Emily smiled. "That sounds perfect." They walked together, their pace easy. The conversation flowed more naturally now, less cautious, more familiar. Emily told him about her students, sharing small, amusing moments from her day. Luke listened, occasionally adding a comment or a quiet laugh. At the market, they moved between tables filled with fresh vegetables, jars of homemade jam, and baskets of warm bread. The air carried a comforting mix of scents, sweet, earthy, familiar. Emily picked up a loaf of bread, examining it with a thoughtful expression. "This looks amazing," she said. "It is," Luke replied. "Best in town." She glanced at him with a hint of amusement. "I'll take your word for it." As they moved through the small crowd, Emily realized something she hadn't expected. She felt at ease, not like an outsider trying to find her place, but like someone slowly becoming part of the rhythm. When they stepped back out onto the street, the sun had dipped lower, painting the sky in soft shades of gold and orange. Emily adjusted her grip on the small bag she carried, then looked over at Luke. "Thank you," she said. For what? For this, she replied, gesturing lightly around them. For making it all feel a little less new. Luke considered that for a moment. Then he gave a small, thoughtful nod. "You're doing that part yourself," he said. "I'm just along for the walk." Emily smiled, but this time she didn't look away. Maybe he was right. Maybe she was finding her place, not all at once, not perfectly, but step by step, and maybe that was enough. As they stood there, the quiet of the evening settling in once again, Emily realized something that would have felt impossible just days ago. The town no longer felt like a place she was passing through. It felt like somewhere she could stay, somewhere she could belong. And for the first time, when she thought about the next church supper, she didn't picture an empty chair. She pictured a seat already waiting, one she wouldn't have to face alone. The following Sunday arrived with a quiet kind of anticipation. Emily noticed it the moment she woke up. It wasn't dramatic, no sudden excitement or rush, but a gentle awareness that the day held something she was actually looking forward to. That, in itself, felt new. Just a week ago, the thought of another church supper might have filled her with hesitation. Now, it felt different. She took her time getting ready, choosing a simple dress and brushing her hair with more care than usual. Sunlight filtered softly through her window, and for once, the quiet of the morning didn't feel heavy. It felt peaceful. Before leaving, she paused by the door for a brief moment, not out of uncertainty, but out of reflection. Then she stepped outside. The church looked just as it had the week before. White walls, tall windows, the same familiar shape against the open sky. But as Emily walked toward the entrance, she realized something important. It wasn't the place that had changed. It was how she felt walking into it. Inside, the fellowship hall buzzed with the same warmth. Tables, lined with food, people greeting each other, laughter weaving through the air. Everything was familiar now, not because she had been here many times, but because she recognized pieces of it, faces, voices, small details. And for the first time, she didn't hesitate at the doorway. She stepped in. Emily arrived a little earlier than most, just as she had the first time. But this time, her reason was different. Instead of hoping to avoid attention, she had come with a quiet intention. She chose a seat at one of the long tables, and then, almost without thinking about it, she placed her hand lightly on the chair beside her, saving it. The gesture felt simple, but it meant something. She arranged her plate, poured a glass of tea, and glanced around the room. People were beginning to arrive, filling the space with movement and conversation. A few familiar faces passed by, offering her small smiles, some even greeting her by name. "Evening, Emily. Good to see you again." Each word settled warmly, building something steady inside her. She smiled back, her responses natural now, no longer forced. Time passed, and the room filled just as it had before, but this time, the chair beside her didn't feel heavy. It felt expected. Emily found herself glancing toward the door more than once, not anxiously, but with quiet curiosity. She told herself she didn't need to. After all, the evening didn't depend on one person. And yet, when the door finally opened, she noticed. Luke stepped inside, much like he had the week before, hat in hand, calm, unhurried. The room greeted him in the same familiar way, but his attention didn't linger. It moved until it found her. For a brief moment, their eyes met across the room, and just like that, the noise around them softened again. Emily didn't look away this time. Instead, she offered a small smile, the kind that carried recognition, not uncertainty. Luke returned it without hesitation. Then, he made his way over. Each step felt natural, unforced, as though the path between them had already been set. When he reached the table, he paused beside the chair, the one she had saved. "Looks like this seat's taken," he said lightly, a familiar warmth in his voice. Emily glanced at the chair, then back at him. "I was hoping it might be," she replied. Luke smiled, the same quiet, steady expression that had first put her at ease. "Well," he said, pulling out the chair, "I wouldn't want to disappoint." He sat down beside her, just as he had before. But this time, everything felt different. Not because the moment was bigger, but because it was shared. They began talking easily, the conversation picking up without effort. The pauses between their words no longer felt uncertain. They felt comfortable. Around them, the supper carried on, but Emily didn't feel like she was on the outside looking in. She was part of it. A few people stopped by their table, exchanging greetings, including her naturally in the flow. Someone asked about her students. Another mentioned seeing her at the market earlier in the week. Small connections, but real ones. Emily responded with ease, her laughter coming freely now, her voice steady and warm. At one point, she glanced down the table, noticing something she hadn't before. There were no empty spaces near her, no distance between her and the rest of the room, and beside her, the chair that had once felt like a quiet reminder of loneliness now held something entirely different. Presence, connection, belonging. She looked back at Luke, who was mid-conversation, his tone easy, his attention genuine. "Thanks for coming," she said softly. Her words meant just for him.